The desert dawn broke over the city of Thebes, and the first rays of sunlight touched the golden tips of the temple of Ammonius. The walls glowed as if alive, painted in lapis blue and sunlit gold, while the chant of hundreds of priests echoed through its halls. Offerings of bread, honey, incense, and cattle filled the courtyards. Outside, farmers brought grain from distant fields. Tax collectors carried chests of silver, and ships on the Nile unloaded goods stamped with the symbol of the god Ammonius. It was not a royal palace. It was a temple. And yet, it was richer than the pharaoh himself. In ancient Egypt, religion was not separate from power. It was power. But over time, that power shifted. The kings of Egypt built temples to honor their gods. But as centuries passed, those temples grew into something more: banks, landowners, and political entities. By the time of the New Kingdom, the temples, especially those of Ammonius and Thebes, had become economic empires that controlled nearly every aspect of Egyptian life. It began innocently enough. Pharaohs believed that their wealth and victories came from divine favor. So they repaid the gods with gifts: gold from Nubia, grain from the Delta, slaves from conquered lands. Every new temple was a monument not just to faith, but to gratitude. But gratitude, when repeated over generations, accumulates. And what accumulated inside those temples wasn't just devotion, it was capital. By the reign of Thutmose III and Amenhotep III, the temples of Egypt owned more land than any noble family. Each god had his own estate: Ammonius in Thebes, Ptah in Memphis, Ra in Heliopolis. These estates stretched across the Nile Valley: farms, quarries, fisheries, even workshops. The temples employed tens of thousands of workers: farmers, scribes, builders, sailors, accountants, and musicians. The wealth of the gods flowed like the Nile itself, constant, powerful, and eternal. To the common Egyptian, working for the temple meant security. Priests offered food, wages, and even protection in times of famine. The temple was both employer and refuge. But for the pharaoh, it was becoming something else: a rival. The pharaoh was considered divine, the living Horus, chosen by the gods to rule. Yet the temples claimed to represent those same gods directly. Every offering given to the temple, even by the pharaoh, was said to belong not to men, but to the deity. That made the temple untouchable. When you entered the temple of Karnak, you weren't walking into a church. You were entering a state within a state. The walls rose like fortress ramparts. The columns towered like trees turned to stone, and every surface shimmered with gold, silver, and rare stones from foreign lands. Behind the sanctuaries were vaults filled with treasures: necklaces, jars of oil, gemstones, papyrus scrolls recording endless inventories. Karnak was more than a place of worship. It was an accounting machine. Every transaction was recorded by scribes with reed pens, every donation measured and stored. The temple collected taxes from farmers, trade tariffs from merchants, and tribute from conquered lands. Even the pharaoh's expeditions were often financed by temple wealth. In the 12th century BCE, at the height of Egypt's power, the temple of Ammonius at Thebes owned nearly one-third of all arable land in the kingdom. It controlled tens of thousands of slaves, cattle, and fields of barley and wheat. It operated fleets of ships on the Nile and the Red Sea. It minted its own silver. It employed its own army of guards and accountants. The pharaohs, blinded by divine faith, continued to feed this machine. Ramses II, the great builder of Egypt, covered the temples with gold leaf and statues of the gods, proclaiming his devotion. He believed that by glorifying Ammonius, he glorified himself. But the temples had learned something the pharaohs hadn't. While dynasties fall, the gods remain. Each pharaoh's power ended with his death. Each temple's power was eternal. As centuries passed, the priesthood of Ammonius grew into a hereditary elite. Sons of priests became high priests. Families passed down sacred offices like royal titles. The priesthood managed the temples with the precision of bankers, not mystics. They developed sophisticated systems of accounting, trade, and investment. While pharaohs ruled the state, the priests ruled the economy. The temples became the lenders of last resort. When the crown needed grain for war or laborers for construction, it often borrowed from the gods at interest. The priests recorded these debts carefully, ensuring that even kings could owe the temple. The gods, in a sense, had become creditors. And so, the divine order of Egypt began to tilt. The pharaoh might rule by decree, but the temples ruled by ownership. The priests didn't need armies. They controlled what everyone needed: land, labor, and food. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten economies that shaped ancient civilizations and how faith quietly became finance, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for the next part of this story. Because as we'll see, the temples didn't just rival pharaohs. They eventually replaced them. As the wealth of Amuni's temples grew, so did their ambition. The priests of Thebes began to appear in royal processions, not as servants of the king, but as his equals. They wore linen robes embroidered with gold, their heads shaven and perfumed with oils, their necks heavy with amulets. They were no longer mere intermediaries between man and God. They were rulers in all but name, and the gods they served had become landlords. By the time of Ramses III, Egypt's temples employed over 80,000 people, more than the entire Egyptian army. Their combined estates stretched from the Delta to Nubia. They controlled herds, vineyards, fishing fleets, and foreign trade, and all of it was tax-exempt. Every pharaoh's gift made them stronger. The system worked, until it didn't. As the economy of Egypt weakened, the temples continued to flourish. They demanded their share of every harvest, every shipment, every conquest. Ordinary Egyptians toiled under double burden: taxes for the pharaoh, tithes for the gods. The priests justified it as divine law. But for the commoner, the gods had become landlords more relentless than kings. And behind the veils of incense and prayer, something deeper was happening. The pharaoh's divine authority, once unquestioned, began to fade. In its place rose the quiet dominance of a different kind of ruler, one who spoke not from a throne, but from an altar. When pharaohs donated wealth to the gods, they thought they were buying eternal favor. In reality, they were selling power, piece by piece, offering by offering. And soon, the temples would own so much of Egypt that even the kings would kneel before their treasuries. By the dawn of the 11th century BCE, Egypt was still magnificent, but the balance of power had quietly shifted. The grand temples of Amun and Thebes had grown into colossal fortresses of wealth and authority, while the pharaoh's palace, once the unquestioned heart of the nation, now looked strangely small beside them. The temples had become more than sanctuaries. They were corporations of eternity. Their estates stretched from the Nile Delta to Nubia. Their grain stores could feed armies. Their fleets carried goods from faraway lands. And their priests no longer whispered prayers to the gods. They negotiated with kings. At the center of it all stood the high priest of Amun, draped in white linen, adorned with gold collars and incense. They ruled Thebes like monarchs of the spirit world. Their word carried as much weight as royal decrees, and their blessings could make or break dynasties. They claimed to speak for the gods, but by then it was clear the gods spoke for them. Ramses III, the last of the great warrior pharaohs, tried to hold back this tide. His reign had been marked by victory and grandeur. He defended Egypt from invasions and built monuments worthy of his lineage. But behind the scenes, the temples he enriched were quietly consuming his kingdom. He had donated vast lands and treasures to Amun's priesthood in exchange for divine favor, but every gift weakened the throne. By the end of his reign, records show that the temples controlled over 1/3 of Egypt's farmland and 2/3 of all industrial production. They owned more than 80,000 workers, farmers, herdsmen, craftsmen, and servants, and commanded resources rivaling the royal treasury itself. The pharaoh, in effect, had financed his own eclipse. When Ramses III was murdered in a palace conspiracy, Egypt entered a period of decline. Political authority fractured, the economy weakened, and corruption spread. But while the royal line faltered, the temples remained steady. In times of famine, they distributed grain. In times of chaos, they offered stability. To the people, the gods seemed stronger than the kings. In Thebes, the high priest of Amun became more powerful than the pharaoh ruling from the north. The position of God's servant of Amun transformed from a spiritual role into a hereditary dynasty of its own. Families like that of Herihor, a high priest during the late New Kingdom, effectively ruled southern Egypt, issuing decrees, minting money, and commanding armies, all under the name of Amun. It was the birth of the priestly pharaohs, men who wore the robes of religion but held the scepters of kings. Their reign marked a strange inversion of Egyptian order. The pharaoh was no longer the living god. The god's priests were the living pharaohs. Inside the great walls of Karnak, the wealth of Egypt glittered. Gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, ivory from Punt, all stored in sanctuaries closed to ordinary eyes. The priests maintained meticulous ledgers, tracking each offering, each tribute, each profit. The gods, it seemed, had accountants. The temples even operated foreign trade networks. Ships financed by Amun's estate sailed the Red Sea, exchanging Egyptian goods for exotic incense and rare spices. Profits flowed back into Thebes, enriching the sanctuaries further. Every transaction, every deal, was written not in the pharaoh's name, but in the gods. Meanwhile, ordinary Egyptians paid the price. Taxes to the crown had not disappeared, but temple dues had multiplied. A farmer's harvest was divided between two powers, the king's tax collectors and the priest's tithe collectors. One served the throne, the other served the gods, yet both took from the same hands. And while the pharaoh's power waned, the priests turned their wealth into influence. They financed festivals that lasted weeks, processions where colossal statues of Amun were carried through the streets. The people cheered and worshipped, unaware that each ceremony was also a political performance. The priests of Amun were not just guardians of faith. They were masters of theater. Even the architecture told the story of shifting power. Pharaohs once built pyramids to glorify themselves. The priests built temples to glorify the gods. But those temples were funded by Pharaoh's wealth. Stone by stone, the divine took precedence over the royal. By the third intermediate period, Egypt had split in two. The north was ruled by nominal pharaohs in Tanis, but the south belonged to the high priests of Thebes. The temples controlled the economy, the administration, and even the army. Egypt had become a theocracy, a nation ruled by its gods. And yet, that theocracy carried the seed of its own decay. The temple's enormous wealth, once a source of stability, turned into stagnation. Gold and grain piled up in vaults, locked away in sacred treasuries that no one dared to touch. The state became paralyzed, rich in assets, poor in motion. When the Libyan dynasties and later the Persians came, Egypt was too divided to resist. The conquerors understood the value of religion. They didn't destroy the temples. They used them. The Persians and later the Greeks under Ptolemy ruled Egypt not by erasing its gods, but by aligning themselves with them. Alexander the Great famously visited the oracle of Amun at Siwa, where priests declared him the son of the god. Even conquerors needed divine endorsement, and in Egypt, the temples still owned that power. But beneath centuries of splendor, a deeper truth lingered. The temples that had outlasted pharaohs could not outlast time. As trade shifted, the Nile's economy weakened, and the cost of maintaining such immense religious estates became unbearable. The gods' accountants could no longer balance the books. When Rome finally absorbed Egypt, the temples were still magnificent, but hollow. Their coffers had been emptied by wars, taxes, and corruption. The priests who once ruled like kings were reduced to bureaucrats serving foreign emperors. The divine economy that had once sustained Egypt had finally collapsed under its own weight. The story of Egypt's temples is not just about religion. It's about the first recorded case in history of spiritual power turning into financial dominance, a civilization where belief itself became currency. The priests of Amun discovered what the bankers of later empires would rediscover. Control the faith, and you control the flow of wealth. The temples did not need armies because they had something stronger: trust. People believed the gods would protect them, bless them, and forgive them. But in the end, it wasn't the gods who demanded payment. It was their priests. Egypt's story, carved in stone and gold, is a reminder how easily power can shift from throne to altar, from crown to creed. And perhaps that's why every empire since has repeated the same pattern, where the institutions built to serve faith or order slowly become richer, stronger, and more enduring than the rulers themselves. Because in the long arc of history, kings come and go, but institutions, temples, banks, corporations, they learn to survive them all. And so, when we look at the ruins of Karnak today, we are not just seeing the remains of a temple. We are looking at the first great prototype of financial power, a monument to the moment when humanity discovered that even gods could be monetized